People think relationships end because of cheating, or betrayal, or loss of attraction. But psychology says something far more dangerous destroys love silently. Pride. Not loud pride. Not obvious arrogance. The quiet kind. The kind that stops people from apologizing, from communicating, from being emotionally vulnerable. For over 4 decades, relationship researcher John Gottman studied thousands of couples to understand why relationships survive or collapse. And what he discovered shocked psychologists around the world. According to research from the Gottman Institute, behaviors like contempt, defensiveness, criticism, and emotional stonewalling are among the strongest predictors of relationship failure. And what quietly fuels all 4? Pride. The need to be right. The refusal to soften first. The inability to say, "I was wrong. I'm hurt. I still care." And the frightening part. Most people don't realize pride is destroying the relationship until emotional distance has already replaced emotional connection. Studies on long-term couples found that emotional withdrawal and unresolved negativity slowly erode relationship satisfaction over time. Sometimes people don't lose the person they love because they stopped caring. They lose them because neither person wanted to be the first to lower their emotional guard. One person waits for the apology. The other waits for reassurance. Days pass. Then weeks. Then silence becomes normal. And this is where relationships quietly begin to die. Because pride rarely destroys love dramatically. It destroys it slowly. Through emotional distance. Through ego battles. Through unspoken resentment. And through the dangerous belief that vulnerability is weakness. And in this video, you'll understand why pride can silently destroy attraction long before a breakup ever happens. Before we continue, comment below. Have you ever watched someone destroy a relationship simply because they refused to admit they were wrong? And subscribe if you enjoy deep female psychology that expose the hidden emotional side of relationships. Pride rarely looks dangerous in the beginning. In fact, it often looks attractive. It looks like self-respect, standards, emotional control, the ability to walk away first, the ability to pretend you don't care. And in modern relationships, that behavior is often praised. People are taught to never look too emotional, never look too available, never appear too invested. So instead of expressing how they feel, they play emotional games. They wait longer to reply. They hide their emotions. They act distant on purpose. Not because they don't care, but because they're terrified of losing emotional power. And slowly, love turns into emotional competition. Who cares less? Who texts first? Who apologizes first? Who breaks silence first? And this is where relationships quietly begin to suffer. Because emotional connection cannot survive where vulnerability feels unsafe. Research published by the American Psychological Association has repeatedly linked defensiveness, emotional withdrawal, and poor conflict repair behaviors to lower relationship satisfaction. In other words, the inability to emotionally reconnect after tension slowly damages intimacy over time. But here's where this becomes psychologically complicated. Pride doesn't always come from arrogance. Sometimes, it comes from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of abandonment. Fear of looking weak. Fear of losing control. Fear of caring more than the other person. And ironically, people often push others away emotionally, while secretly hoping to feel closer to them. A man refuses to apologize, even though he misses her deeply. A woman acts emotionally cold, even though she wants reassurance. Neither person says what they truly feel. So both people slowly become strangers. And according to attachment psychology researchers, emotional avoidance is often a defense mechanism designed to protect people from emotional pain. But protection has a cost. The more emotionally guarded people become, the harder intimacy becomes. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some people unconsciously sabotage the very relationships they desperately want to keep. The coldest people are not always the strongest people. Sometimes, they're simply the most emotionally wounded. A woman notices something changing in her relationship. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just slowly. After arguments, her boyfriend stops explaining himself. Stops communicating. Stops trying to fix things. And eventually, his favorite sentence becomes, "Do whatever you want." At first, she thinks he's calm, unbothered, emotionally in control. But over time, the emotional distance starts feeling different. His silence no longer feels peaceful. It feels cold. He answers with fewer words, avoids deeper conversations, acts emotionally unavailable after conflict. And this is where female psychology becomes important. Women often analyze emotional presence more than men realize. Not just what a man says, but how emotionally engaged he remains during tension. So when a man emotionally withdraws repeatedly, many women begin interpreting that behavior as emotional disinterest, even if he still loves her deeply. And according to attachment psychology research, emotional avoidance often masks fear of vulnerability rather than lack of emotion. In other words, some people shut down emotionally, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much. They don't know how to express hurt without feeling weak. They don't know how to communicate pain without feeling exposed. So instead of saying, "That argument hurt me," they emotionally disappear. Instead of saying, "I'm afraid of losing you," they become distant. And pride quietly convinces them this emotional withdrawal is strength. But it isn't. It's emotional self-protection. And the tragic part, the more emotionally unavailable someone becomes, the more emotionally unsafe the relationship starts to feel. A woman may stop feeling emotionally chosen, emotionally heard, emotionally connected. Not because the love disappeared, but because the emotional openness disappeared. And over time, silence starts replacing intimacy. And that's where pride becomes even more destructive. Many relationships don't collapse because of constant fighting. They collapse because communication slowly disappears. After one argument, two people stop talking. Not forever. Just temporarily. At least that's what both of them believe. A few hours pass. Then an entire day. He stares at her profile but refuses to text first. She checks her phone repeatedly, pretending not to care. Both people secretly want reconciliation. Both people miss each other. Both people hope the other person reaches out first. But neither one does. 3 days later, the silence feels heavier than the argument itself. And this is something relationship psychology repeatedly warns about. Conflict is not always the real danger. Emotional disconnection is. Because arguments at least show emotional engagement. Silence often signals emotional withdrawal. And in female psychology, emotional effort matters deeply. Women often analyze consistency, emotional presence, and communication effort more than logical explanations. So when communication suddenly disappears, the mind starts creating emotional conclusions. Maybe he doesn't care anymore. Maybe the relationship means less to him now. Maybe emotionally, he's already leaving. And the frightening part? Sometimes none of those things are true. Sometimes the other person is simply trapped inside their own pride. They want to text. They want to reconnect. But pride whispers, "Don't chase. Don't look weak." If they cared, they would reach out first. And slowly, ego turns silence into emotional distance. Research from the Gottman Institute shows that emotional repair attempts, even small ones, strongly predict long-term relationship stability. In other words, healthy couples are not couples who never experience conflict. They are couples who know how to emotionally reconnect after conflict. But pride interrupts that process. It delays the apology, delays the conversation, delays emotional repair. And this is where silence becomes dangerous. Because silence feels powerful in the moment, but destructive over time. It gives the illusion of control. But underneath that silence, resentment quietly grows. Emotional confusion grows. Distance grows. And eventually, two people who still care about each other begin acting like strangers. But things become even more toxic when pride turns the relationship into emotional competition. Some people would rather win the argument than protect the relationship. And they don't even realize they're doing it. What begins as a simple disagreement slowly turns into emotional warfare. One partner brings up something painful from the past. The other immediately becomes defensive. Voices become colder. Words become sharper. And suddenly, the conversation is no longer about understanding each other. It becomes about victory. Who's more right? Who's more hurt? Who apologizes first? Who has more emotional power? A couple argues about one small issue. But within minutes, old mistakes from 6 months ago get dragged back into the conversation. Past failures, past disappointments, past insecurities. Neither person wants to feel emotionally defeated. So instead of listening, they emotionally attack. And this is where relationships quietly become emotionally unsafe. Because people open up emotionally only where they feel safe emotionally. Not judged. Not humiliated. Not constantly punished for being vulnerable. And female psychology is deeply connected to emotional safety. A woman may still love someone deeply. But if conversations constantly leave her feeling emotionally attacked, misunderstood, or emotionally exhausted, she slowly starts disconnecting internally. Not always immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually. She talks less. Explains less. Expresses less. Because emotionally, she no longer feels safe enough to fully open up. And according to relationship psychologists, emotional safety is one of the strongest foundations of long-term intimacy and attraction. Not perfection. Not appearance. Not status. Emotional safety. The ability to communicate without fear of humiliation. The ability to disagree without emotional destruction. The ability to feel heard instead of emotionally overpowered. But pride destroys that environment. Because pride focuses more on protecting the ego than protecting the connection. And this creates one of the biggest contradictions in relationships. Both people may still love each other, while simultaneously destroying the emotional space required for love to survive. And when pride enters the room, understanding quietly leaves. Listening disappears. Empathy disappears. Softness disappears. All that remains is emotional defense. And eventually, the relationship stops feeling emotionally comforting and starts feeling emotionally exhausting. But there's another hidden reason pride quietly destroys attraction. Human beings crave emotional intimacy. They crave connection, understanding, Reassurance. The feeling of being emotionally chosen by someone. But pride creates a strange contradiction. People want deep love, while resisting the vulnerability required to create it. A man lies awake at night thinking about his ex. He rereads old messages, checks her social media, replays old memories in his head. He misses her deeply, but he refuses to call. Not because he stopped caring, because he's afraid of appearing weak. So instead of expressing what he truly feels, he says nothing. And this is one of the most destructive things pride does to relationships. It teaches people to hide emotions that actually need to be communicated. Pride whispers, "Don't let them know you miss them. Don't let them know you're hurt. Don't be the one who cares more." And over time, emotional suppression starts replacing emotional intimacy. Because pride often convinces people that emotional openness equals emotional weakness. But psychologically, the opposite is usually true. Emotionally mature people are not the people who feel nothing. They are the people brave enough to express difficult emotions honestly. And this matters deeply in female psychology. Women are often emotionally drawn toward emotional honesty more than emotional perfection. Not flawless men. Not robotic men. Not emotionally unavailable men pretending to have complete control. But men who can communicate authentically. Men who can express emotion without collapsing emotionally. Because emotional honesty creates emotional trust. And trust creates emotional safety. This is one of the reasons researcher Brené Brown became widely known for her work on vulnerability and human connection. Her research repeatedly showed that vulnerability strengthens emotional intimacy, trust, and authentic connection. But pride resists vulnerability. Because vulnerability requires uncertainty. It requires risking rejection, risking disappointment, risking emotional exposure. And many people would rather appear emotionally strong than emotionally honest. So they hide affection, hide pain, hide attachment. And eventually, the relationship becomes emotionally shallow. Now pay attention to this part. Because the next behavior quietly destroys attraction without people even realizing it. Many people confuse emotional detachment with emotional strength. They believe the person who cares less has more power. So they train themselves to appear emotionally unaffected, less expressive, less vulnerable, less emotionally available. But over time, that emotional coldness starts damaging the relationship itself. A woman notices the shift slowly. She tries to reconnect emotionally after tension. She asks questions, attempts deeper conversations, tries to understand what's wrong. But her partner responds with indifference. Short answers, minimal emotion, little reassurance. Eventually, every emotional conversation starts feeling one-sided. She begins feeling like she's emotionally reaching for someone who no longer reaches back. And this creates something dangerous in female psychology. Emotional exhaustion. Because women often interpret repeated emotional dismissal as emotional rejection. Not always consciously, but emotionally. She may still love him, still care deeply, still want the relationship to work. But internally, she slowly stops feeling emotionally safe enough to keep trying. So her energy changes. She becomes quieter, less expressive, less emotionally open. Not because she suddenly stopped caring, but because emotional effort without emotional response becomes painful. And this is where many people misunderstand attraction. They think attraction disappears because of boredom, or appearance, or time. But sometimes attraction fades because emotional connection slowly disappears. Because people don't feel emotionally seen anymore. emotionally heard anymore, emotionally valued anymore. And according to relationship psychology, emotional responsiveness is one of the strongest predictors of emotional intimacy and long-term relationship satisfaction. In simple terms, people feel closer to those who emotionally respond to them. But pride interferes with that process. Because pride says, don't let them know you care too much. Don't look emotionally dependent. Stay emotionally guarded. And at first, that emotional distance may even appear attractive. It can create mystery, control, emotional tension. But long-term relationships cannot survive on emotional distance alone. They require emotional risk. The risk of reassurance. The risk of honesty. The risk of emotional openness. Because intimacy is impossible when both people are pretending not to care. And the frightening part? Many people realize this only after emotional damage has already been done. If you're still watching, you already understand something most people never do. Relationships rarely collapse instantly. They slowly erode emotionally. So hit the like button if you want more deep female psychology documentaries exposing the hidden emotional dynamics behind attraction and relationships. For some people, apologizing feels more painful than losing the relationship. And psychologically, that says a lot about how powerful pride can become. A couple argues over something small. A misunderstanding. A moment of frustration. Something that could have been resolved with one honest conversation. But neither person reaches out afterward. Days pass. Then weeks. Both people are hurting silently. He waits for her to apologize first. She waits for him to show emotional effort. Both replay the argument in their minds. Both miss each other. Both secretly hope the other person breaks the silence. But neither one does. And eventually, the relationship starts collapsing under the weight of unspoken emotion. Not because love disappeared. Because pride became stronger than vulnerability. This is the hidden danger of ego in relationships. It protects the ego temporarily, while damaging emotional connection permanently. Because every delayed apology increases emotional distance. Every moment of stubborn silence creates more misunderstanding, more resentment, more emotional detachment. And over time, the relationship stops feeling emotionally safe to repair. And this is something many men misunderstand in female psychology. Women often view sincere accountability as emotional maturity. Not weakness. Not submission. Not loss of power. But emotional strength. The ability to say, I handled that poorly. I understand your pain. I don't want my ego to destroy this connection. Because accountability creates emotional security. It shows emotional awareness, emotional control, emotional leadership. But pride resists accountability. Because pride is obsessed with self-protection. It would rather defend the ego than repair the relationship. And ironically, people often lose relationships they deeply value, simply because neither person wanted to be emotionally vulnerable first. But pride doesn't only damage communication. It also slowly changes attraction itself. Attraction doesn't always disappear overnight. Sometimes, it fades slowly through emotional exhaustion. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because there's no dramatic ending at first. No explosive breakup. No obvious betrayal. Just gradual emotional disconnection. A woman who once sent long messages now replies with short answers. She stops initiating conversations. Stops expressing her feelings as openly. Stops reacting emotionally the way she used to. At first, her partner assumes she's simply tired, busy, distracted. But emotionally, something deeper is happening. She's becoming emotionally numb. And emotional numbness is often the final stage of prolonged emotional disappointment. Because when emotional needs are repeatedly ignored, the mind slowly adapts by lowering emotional investment. In psychology, this is sometimes connected to emotional withdrawal and protective detachment. In simple terms, people stop emotionally reaching when they no longer believe emotional connection is safe, reciprocated, or meaningful. And this is where pride quietly becomes destructive again. Because emotional distance often begins with unresolved tension that was never emotionally repaired. One person stops communicating openly. The other becomes defensive. Silence increases. Affection decreases. And eventually, both people begin emotionally surviving the relationship, instead of emotionally enjoying it. And according to relationship experts, emotional responsiveness is one of the strongest predictors of long-term relationship satisfaction. Not perfection. Not constant happiness. Emotional responsiveness. The ability to notice emotional needs. Respond to emotional bids. Repair emotional tension before resentment grows. But pride interferes with all of that. Because pride delays emotional repair. It delays vulnerability. It delays emotional reassurance. And over time, small emotional disappointments accumulate. And this is the frightening part. Most people don't notice the relationship is emotionally dying. Until emotional effort completely disappears. Until good morning texts disappear. Deep conversations disappear. Affection disappears. And by that point, the emotional connection has often been weakening silently for a very long time. But emotional distance creates another painful problem that many couples never talk about. You can sleep beside someone every night and still feel completely emotionally alone. And that kind of loneliness is often more painful than physical distance. Because the person you want comfort from is the same person you no longer feel emotionally connected to. At the beginning of a relationship, affection usually feels natural. People express emotion freely. They communicate openly. They reassure each other without hesitation. But over time, unresolved tension changes the emotional atmosphere. One partner becomes emotionally guarded after feeling misunderstood. The other becomes quieter after feeling emotionally rejected. And slowly, both people stop expressing affection the way they once did. They stop saying what they feel. Stop initiating emotional conversations. Stop giving reassurance freely. Not because the love completely disappeared, but because vulnerability started feeling emotionally risky. So both people begin emotionally protecting themselves. He stops expressing softness because he fears looking weak. She stops expressing emotional needs because she fears rejection. And eventually, the relationship becomes emotionally transactional instead of emotionally connected. They discuss responsibilities, schedules, bills, daily routines. But the emotional intimacy that once made the relationship feel alive starts fading quietly. And this creates a painful emotional contradiction. Two people can remain physically close, while emotionally drifting further apart every month. And female psychology is deeply affected by emotional intimacy. Women often emotionally disconnect when emotional closeness, reassurance, and emotional presence disappear consistently over time. Not because women expect perfection, but because emotional connection is often tied closely to emotional security. When emotional intimacy disappears, attraction can slowly begin fading with it. And this is why emotional neglect is so dangerous. It rarely feels catastrophic in the moment. It feels subtle, small, gradual. But repeated emotional distance slowly changes how people feel about each other. And pride often accelerates that process. Because pride tells people to suppress vulnerability instead of rebuilding intimacy. To stay guarded instead of emotionally reconnecting. And eventually, both people become emotionally lonely inside the very relationship meant to bring them comfort. But the final stage of pride is where the damage becomes truly devastating. The most painful apologies usually happen after emotional damage has already been done. After the distance. After the silence. After someone finally gives up emotionally. And this is the tragic reality of pride. It often delays emotional honesty until the relationship is already broken. A man finally reaches out to his ex months after the breakup. He types the message slowly. Deletes it. Rewrites it again. For the first time, he finally says what he truly feels. I miss you. You mattered to me. I should have communicated better. I should have fought for us instead of protecting my ego. But emotionally, she already detached long ago. Not necessarily because she stopped loving him instantly, but because emotional exhaustion slowly replaced emotional hope. She waited during the silence. Waited during the emotional distance. Waited during the unanswered tension. But eventually, her mind adapted to his absence. And this is something relationship psychology repeatedly shows. Human beings emotionally adapt to prolonged emotional disconnection. What once felt emotionally unbearable slowly becomes emotionally normal. And that's why delayed vulnerability can become so painful. Because sometimes the apology arrives after the emotional bond has already weakened beyond repair. The frightening part is this. Many people genuinely love each other, while simultaneously destroying the emotional connection through pride. They care deeply, miss each other deeply, think about each other constantly, but neither person expresses it honestly. So silence slowly does what conflict could not. It erodes emotional intimacy. And people often realize the value of emotional vulnerability only after emotional distance costs them someone important. Only after the calls stop. The effort stops. The emotional attachment stops. And by then, regret becomes heavier than ego ever was. And this leads to the biggest hidden truth about pride and relationships. Here's the part most people never talk about. Pride is rarely just ego. Sometimes, it's pain wearing emotional armor. It's unresolved hurt trying to protect itself from further rejection. It's disappointment hiding behind emotional distance. Fear hiding behind emotional coldness. Insecurity hiding behind control. And this is why relationships become psychologically complicated. Because people's behavior often hides emotions they cannot express directly. A woman may appear emotionally distant, while secretly hoping her partner fights emotionally for the relationship. She may act colder, less expressive, less emotionally available. But internally, she's waiting for reassurance. Waiting for emotional effort. Waiting to feel emotionally chosen again. And a man may appear emotionally detached, while secretly terrified of rejection. He acts calm, unbothered, emotionally controlled. But internally, he fears vulnerability, fears abandonment, fears hearing the words, I don't need you anymore. So instead of expressing emotion honestly, both people protect themselves emotionally. And this is the tragic contradiction pride creates. Many relationships do not end because love completely disappeared. They end because fear became stronger than vulnerability. Fear of rejection. Fear of emotional exposure. Fear of losing emotional power. And slowly, two people who still care deeply about each other begin emotionally hiding from each other. And the saddest part? Both people often still love each other. Both people still think about each other. Still miss each other. still replay old memories in silence. But neither person knows how to lower their emotional guard first. So pride quietly keeps two emotionally wounded people trapped inside emotional distance. And this is why emotionally mature people are rare. Because emotional maturity requires things the ego naturally resists: accountability, vulnerability, emotional control, self-awareness, and the courage to soften first. The courage to communicate instead of withdraw. To repair instead of punish. To listen instead of defend. Because real emotional strength is not emotional coldness. It's emotional honesty. It's the ability to remain emotionally open, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. And the strongest people in relationships are rarely the proudest. They're usually the people emotionally brave enough to repair connection before silence destroys it. Pride feels powerful in the moment, but love survives through emotional humility. The people who keep healthy relationships aren't perfect. They simply understand something many people never learn. Being emotionally vulnerable is not weakness. Sometimes saving a relationship begins with one honest conversation, one apology, one moment of emotional softness, before distance becomes permanent. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more deep female psychology breakdowns, subscribe to the channel. And watch the next video on screen now. Because understanding emotional behavior changes the way you see relationships forever. Like and subscribe for more videos like this.